All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting something. I don't know what this is, but I am tired of talking about an FAQ that may or may not be legit. So, what I do want to talk about today is what I believe is probably one of the biggest mistakes that D&D 5th edition did, which was dropping the faction system. Now, especially if you are newer to D&D just in general, or D&D 5th edition specifically, and by newer I mean within the last probably about like 4 to 5 years, you may not have any idea what the faction system is. So, let me tell you about one of the cooler things that they designed to go with not only 5th edition, but actually the Adventurers League, which is the organized play program that uses 5th edition. Way back when, in the before times, before D&D was done and the whole world was driving off a cliff of insanity, there were 5 factions. 5 singular entities that worked together sometimes, but mostly had their own ideas about how the world should work. And they used adventurers to get that work done. So, way back when the Adventurers League first started, they're part of creating your Adventures League character was you were not required, but you could join what was called a faction. And there were 5 factions available. They were the Harpers, the Lord's Alliance, oh, wow, I feel dumb. I'm going to actually look up, because I'm forgetting one of them. Order of the Gauntlet, that's what it is. But before I say the wrong thing, there we go. So, the factions were the Lord's Alliance, the Harpers, the Order of the Gauntlet, the Emerald Enclave, and the Zentarum. I believe all of these predate D&D 5th edition. Like, the Harpers have been around forever. They were started by Elminster. The Emerald Enclave has been around for a really long time. The Zentarum have been the bad guys in quite a few 2nd and 3rd edition adventures. And the Lord's Alliance was kind of a pseudo bad guy organization every so often, but it was sometimes referenced in books and other things like that. But there were these 5 factions, and like I said, players could join one of these factions. And there were a couple benefits to joining a faction. The most obvious one in the D&D Adventures League, because it's an organized play campaign and your character exists outside of the tables you play at, so you can just take your character to various conventions or to various game stores or even play online. There was rules about how all that worked. You could just bring your character and play an adventure as long as the character was at the right level for the adventure and that specific character hadn't played that adventure before. But if your character died, the character was gone. You would have to, like, all the magic items attached to it were gone. All the experience you put into it, you could never play that character again. Now, there are some ways around this. If your party members paid for a resurrection spell, you could use gold to resurrect someone after an adventure. You could bring that character back, but they wouldn't get any experience or anything from that adventure, and they couldn't run that adventure again. They would count as having played the adventure, but they didn't get any rewards from it. The other way, like if a party member actually casts a resurrection spell, like Revivify or something on you, then the character's fine in the game, and you get to keep everything. But the other way, up until level 5, you could get a resurrection, because until level 5, you didn't have the gold for a resurrection. If I remember correctly, a resurrection was, I think it was either 1,000 or 25 or 1,250 gold. So 1,250 gold. I think it's been a while. And so if you had that much money on your character, you could pay for a resurrection. So you didn't lose the character, you just lost out on everything. However, low-level characters, that couldn't happen. You would never have that much money on you until you reached minimum of level 5. Like, they're just, the rewards you would get would never be enough to do that. So, one of the benefits of joining a faction was they would resurrect your character for free. So as long as you belonged to a faction, you had a get out of death free card. The same limitations applied. If you died during an adventure, you didn't get any rewards or experience or anything from the adventure, but you couldn't replay it. So that kind of sucked. But you had this get out of death free card, which was really, really nice. And in the early seasons of the Adventures League, there wasn't really an issue with not being able to play enough adventures to get up to tier 2, because the early version of the Adventures League, you could go between seasons and play whatever adventures you wanted. The new one, you're limited only to the season that is currently the most recent. And all the previous seasons, you have to use what's called a legacy character, which that's a whole debacle in and of itself. So that was one of the big reasons why most people would choose a faction. However, there were other benefits. Every time you did adventures, you could get renown with your faction. And as your renown grew with your faction, you would be able to get certain perks based on your faction. Like the Lord's Alliance, you could basically get a squire for an adventure. Or the Harpers, you could get, if I remember correctly, you could get some spell scrolls for cheaper than they were normally. And as you got higher and higher and got more renown, you got more cool things. That's not why I think abandoning the factions was a mistake. Those were cool benefits, and they were really, really fun. But the best part of the faction system was in how it changed your adventuring experience. Let me explain why. So, if you look at early D&D Adventures League modules, you can still buy them on the DM's Guild, and you can still run them as official Adventures League modules. They're just considered legacy. So any character that's playing in the new season won't be able to play them. But any character that has existed ever can go back and play the Season 1 or the Season 2 adventures. And if you read any of them, in the hook section, they will have a generic hook. And then they will generally have at least one or two faction-specific hooks, where it'll say, well, the Harpers have asked you to look into this aspect of this adventure, and they specifically want you to find this. Or the Zentarim have a spy that has mentioned that this particular person might be involved, and we would prefer that particular person no longer be involved in anything. Do with that information what you will, but if we find out that we don't have to worry about them anymore, we'll be very happy. And the interesting thing about it was when you were running an Adventures League table with these faction things, what would happen is at the beginning of the session, you would go, by the way, what are your factions? And you would jot down everybody's factions. Or one of the things that was really common at the time is they actually had these official D&D Adventures League table tents, which was just a regular piece of paper that had a cut in it, so you could fold it into a little triangle, and it had your character name and level, and would also have your faction on it. So what happened at the beginning, they would go, okay, who do we have? Anyone in the Emerald Enclave? Okay, come with me. And you would tell them in secret, hey, this is your particular mission. Only Emerald Enclave members are aware of this mission. And you would do that for each faction. Like I said, it wasn't generally, you didn't get a faction mission for every single faction. You didn't get a faction hook for every single adventure. But generally, each adventure would have at least a couple hooks for specific factions. And a few of those, in addition to those hooks, you would have a special mission that if you completed it, you would get additional renown. And it was really, really fun, because that meant you could have a team of 5 people that were all on the same adventure with the same mission, but different members might have different motivations as to why they wanted to be in that mission, and they might have different things that they wanted to do on that mission. And probably the most interesting is sometimes um, there were faction missions that were conflicting. So one faction may want to save this person, another faction may want that person to just disappear. Maybe not outright assassinate them or anything, but maybe just like, if you're given the chance of, accidentally leaving them on their own, we would be okay with that. We'll take care of everything else. You just put them in a situation where they're alone. And it was really, really cool because it created significantly more dynamic, interesting adventures. Now, starting at season, I want to say, it's either 5 or 6, the D&D Adventures League, which at that point I don't believe was owned by Wizards of the Code yet. They might have been, I can't remember. It might have been right when they picked it up. Because for those of you who don't know, the Adventures League used to be independent. They were not owned by Wizards of the Coast at all. And it was a massively stupid thing to do because WotC actually got sued, not for anything related to Dungeons & Dragons, but they actually got sued by a bunch of Magic the Gathering judges because judging for Magic the Gathering tournaments was a volunteer position. You didn't get paid for it. A lot of times you would get kind of benefits, like sometimes you'd get hotel rooms if it was at like a convention or something, or you might get free packs of cards or something like that. But you were 100% not, you were not hired, you were not working for Wizards of the Coast. And labor laws being what they are, which a lot of people don't realize, just because a company says you're an independent contractor does not mean you're an independent contractor. And just because a company says you're a volunteer does not mean you're a volunteer. There are very, very specific rules about what an independent contractor is, what a volunteer is and isn't. And probably the most important rule for volunteers is no for-profit company in the world or in the country can use volunteer labor. It is 100% illegal. There's no possible way a for-profit company can use volunteer labor. The only people that are allowed to accept volunteers are public companies, which are basically companies owned by the government. And even then, there's only very specific governmental companies that can accept volunteers. And charities and nonprofits, they're allowed to accept volunteers. And they have very, very specific rules about what a volunteer can and cannot do for the company. So anyway, the Magic judges sued them for improper classification of a worker. If I remember correctly, they won. And Wizards got into big trouble but because of it. Or they might have settled out of court, I can't remember. But Wizards got into big trouble with it because the D&D Adventures League was basically working as a marketing arm for Wizards of the Coast, and they weren't... and everybody that worked for the Adventures League were volunteers. Like, I was a volunteer local coordinator. I got paid nothing and put more work into the Adventures League than I did to some of the jobs I used to have where I was paid. Like, it was an insane amount of work that I did for free. So anyway, going back, around season 5 or 6, they stated that characters could no longer belong to factions unless there is a specific background they created called Faction Agent. So if you wanted to stay a member of your faction, you had to get rid of the background you had and replace it with the Faction Agent background. One of the few attempts of them trying to find a way to make backgrounds useful again and at the same time get rid of the faction system. And it went over like a lead balloon. Most people were really pissed off at it. That was the last season that I played because I had this really awesome... My Shadow Monk Aether was... Not only was he a faction member of the Lord's Alliance, he was like rank 4 of 5 in the Lord's Alliance, meaning he... they had names for each of the ranks, and my rank 5 was faction leader. So I was just below faction leader with this character, and I'd spent 4 or 5 years at that point playing this character and getting them to the point where they were this really awesome character. And the Lord's Alliance was a massive, massive part of my backstory and everything. But I was also like that character. His background was a criminal, and if I lost criminal, I would lose things like I would lose my training in lockpicks, which was really important for my character because he was a monk, he was a shadow monk, but he could do everything a rogue could. So a lot of times, if we didn't have a rogue in the party, I was the substitute rogue, and I generally was better at being a rogue than most rogues. Because I had a lot of things like I could teleport and I could run on walls and all this cool stuff, and I never needed a weapon because I could stun people and throw them off of balconies and stuff. Like, it was super fun. So anyway, that season they started kind of de-emphasizing the role of factions, and then I think the season after that they just ditched factions altogether. And for me personally, I believe that was the biggest mistake they could have made. And the reason why is the faction system added so much more to the game than any other system that they've implemented thus. I'm going to try this again because my brain isn't working. Than any other system they have introduced since then. And the interesting thing about the faction system, I was reading. I can't remember if it was a Reddit post or it was an interview or something, but it was on a topic that I really enjoy discussing, which is kind of the downfall of D&D, starting with like 3rd edition and 4th edition, and then 5th edition is when it became really, really big again. But Wizards made quite a few mistakes in 3rd edition, and then made a few more mistakes in 4th edition, and then fixed most of them, not all, with 5th edition. And I was I wasn't talking, but I was listening to someone, and they specifically mentioned, it might have been a comment on a YouTube video, but anyway, they mentioned that they were working in the games industry, as in tabletop, like board games industry. They were working in a friendly local game store around the time that 3rd edition was being developed and it came out. And they mentioned that something that was really, really big around that time was D&D had their first major competitor show up on the market. Because up until then, again, D&D started in the 70s. And it was the only game in town for the most part, all the way through most of the 90s. Were there other systems that came out in like the 80s and stuff like that? Absolutely. They didn't hold a candle to Dungeons and Dragons in that particular market. All the way up until, like I said, the mid 90s, or maybe the early 90s, this company came out called White Wolf, and they created a game called Vampire the Masquerade. Any of you that are familiar with... and I'm actually going to check because it might be that they... Really? I can't even type? It might have actually... Oh yeah, it was released in 1991. So yeah, early 90s. Vampire the Masquerade came out, and everything else was effectively... if you think in terms of like the MMO market, when EverQuest, like first you had Ultima Online, and no one really tried to copy Ultima Online. Like you had Neverwinter that kind of worked similar, and it turned into kind of an MMO thing. But EverQuest was the first really, really big popular MMO. And then every MMO that came out after it that was kind of similar to it would be called an EverQuest clone. And then World of Warcraft came out. And since then, though the term has become significantly less popular in the last like 4 or 5 years, any kind of major MMO that came out was a WoW clone or a WoW killer. Well, Vampire the Masquerade would really be the first kind of non-D&D clone that came out, because Vampire the Masquerade didn't work anything like D&D. And that's not to say that there weren't RPGs. Like I think, what was it, Paranoia came out and that played nothing like D&D. So I'm not saying that there weren't any others. But this is the first one that really sunk its teeth into the market and was extremely different from Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons was heroic fantasy. You know, it was a bunch of people coming together as a party and defeating the bad guy. Vampire the Masquerade was politics, deception, lying, and sex. Like, it was almost the antithesis of D&D in every way, shape, or form. You didn't use a D20 in it. I don't believe you did. The dice rolls themselves were very, very different. Your character sheet looked very, very different. There weren't classes. You had clans, which gave you access to certain vampiric abilities, but they really didn't work like classes. They were just very, very different. And you generally did not have a party of everyone from the same clan. Every single, or almost every single, game of Vampire the Masquerade, you had different people from different clans, and every clan had their own motivation, had their own goals that they wanted, and in any situation, no matter what the party was trying to do, because the party was trying to work together anyway, but there was, you know, everybody had multiple loyalties. You had your loyalty to your friends, which were the party members. Then you also had loyalty to your clan. And you might have to deal with loyalty to the Carmilla or anything else. Like, there was all these kind of shifting loyalties, and there was a lot of politics and a lot of role playing, and it's a really, really fascinating, interesting system. I am a huge fan of the World of Darkness series, which is all their different ones. They have Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, Mage the Ascension, Hunter the Reckoning, and then Changeling the something. So those are the 5 different games, and they've gone through various things. Right now, I believe the only kind of quote-unquote modern adaptation is they have a 5th edition of Vampire, which is not D&D 5th edition. It is the 5th version of Vampire the Masquerade, and it's currently real big. And I think they were working on creating a new... They were either working on, or they had actually completed a new Werewolf. Everything else, they still have editions you can buy. Like, I have copies of Mage the Ascension, and I have copies of every single thing except for Vampire, which I got for free at the beginning of the pandemic, because White Wolf just gave them all out for free. It was great. So anyway, so this was a really, really big deal in the 90s, and White Wolf was actually getting popular compared to everything else. Like, literally the rest of the time, D&D was always number 1, and everyone else was fighting for number 2. Everyone else was competing for second place because first place was so far beyond them. And I'm not saying that White Wolf was challenging D&D's superiority. It wasn't. But for the first time, White Wolf was the clear number 2, and everyone else was fighting for third place. And that, not only did that scare D&D a little bit, but it scared the whole market. The entire market tried to start adding faction systems into their games. They wanted this really, because it is a really cool idea where, you know, you and the members of your party might be doing the same things, but you're doing the same things for vastly different reasons. And because of that, certain choices become very, very different and very significantly more interesting. And so everything was starting to try and add a faction system to it. And apparently 3rd edition D&D tried to do something like that. I wasn't playing the tabletop version of D&D at that point, so I don't know the whole story behind that. But according to this person, there were a lot of whispers and things like that D&D was going to add a quote-unquote faction system to their game for 3rd edition, and it just never really materialized, or if it did, it just didn't catch on. And they focused more on the hyper complexity of 3rd edition. And 4th edition came around, and to my knowledge, they didn't try to add a faction system to that. But by the time 5th edition came around, they'd learned from a bunch of mistakes, and they wanted to implement a faction system because Vampire was still really popular. Especially in that hiatus point where, remember, I've said this many, many times, people claim that, well, Pathfinder was the number 1 game for a time. It's the only game that has ever toppled D&D. Technically, that is true. For about a year and a half, they were selling more than, or it might have been 2 years. They were selling more than did a D&D. The reason why is D&D wasn't releasing any products. So, of course, they were selling more. They weren't competing with anyone. And I've gone on diatribes about that. But anyway, even while that was happening, White Wolf was still doing semi-good. White Wolf ran into a bunch of problems financially, and then it got bought out by something else. Like, it turned into a weird thing. But Vampire the Masquerade, no matter who owned it, has always offered something unique that D&D had never been able to offer in that kind of faction clan system. And it's present in every one of their games. The system that they use is what's called the Storyteller system. It's a really, really unique, interesting system. Every single one of them, they have factions. Now, it may not be as clear-cut as the clan system in Vampire the Masquerade, but part of character creation is you are going to choose something that differentiates you from the other players. And unlike a class-based system where all it does is really differentiate your abilities, what your choices in the Storyteller system are going to differentiate you politically. They're going to be a motivating factor for a lot of the things that you do. And it's a really interesting thing. So, the faction system in 5th edition was the first time I have seen that D&D was able to pull off a system like that, and it worked remarkably well. Like I said, I remember playing a couple different adventures where we had they generally didn't allow conflicting faction assignments very often. Like, I think in the entirety of the faction assignments, I think there was maybe one or two where, like, one faction would want this person dead and another faction would want them alive or something like that. I think that only happened a couple times. But there were situations where, and you were encouraged to not tell other people your faction goals, especially if you were part of the Lord's Alliance or the Zentarum. If you were playing alignment-wise in the D&D Adventure League, you could play any good or neutral alignment, but if you wanted to play an evil character, you could only play a lawful evil character. And one of the prereqs in the early version was if you were playing a lawful evil character, you had to belong to either the Lord's Alliance or to the Zentarum. You were not allowed to play a lawful evil character if you didn't belong to one of those two factions, because it gave a little bit of control to the DM to avoid people that don't know how to play evil characters just doing nonsense. Because they could just say, well, the Zentarum are pissed off that you're doing all this stuff and you're giving them a bad name. So the Zentarum have told you to either stop or they will stop you. And you know exactly how the Zentarum stop people. You will disappear and no one will ever hear from you again. Do we have an understanding? And so yeah, it was meant as a control thing. But because of that, the Lord's Alliance and the Zentarum very often would strongly encourage their members. You do not tell anyone you belong to the Zentarum. You only tell other in the Zentarum that you belong, or you do not mention to people that you belong to the Lord's Alliance, unless it's to curry favor with people, because the Lord's Alliance was capitalism. That's what it was. The reason my Shadow Monk was a member of the Lord's Alliance is because he was an assassin for hire, and they were the only ones that could afford him. That was his backstory, and my favorite thing in every single adventure was when we would get the hook and someone would go, "We need you to do this," I would always respond with, "I don't work for free." Or he had a British accent, so "I don't work for free. What are you offering?" And it was super, super fun. I had a couple dungeon masters go, "I can't offer you money," and I have to go out of character. You can just say you can keep whatever you find, which is how the Adventures League worked. Was if you found gold or anything, you got to keep it. You can just say, well, you can keep whatever you find, and I'm sure the amount of money you will find in this adventure, the amount of goods you find in this adventure, will be far more than I would ever be able to pay you. So I would tell them, like, this is the password you have to give for him to work with you. But from my character standpoint, I won't back down without being paid. So just give me some bullshit of like, keep what you find. But yeah, I had a lot of fun with that character, and again, the Lord's Alliance is a big deal. So anyway, you were generally, and even with groups like the Harpers or the Emerald Enclave, which are generally good aligned organizations, the Harpers are massively secret. The Emerald Enclave, for lack of a better term, are a little bit xenophobic, where they really, really love anyone that's in the Emerald Enclave. They hate everybody else. They were hyper tree huggers, and so yeah, it was strongly encouraged that you don't reveal to the other players what your secret goal is. And so every so often you would have to try and come up with it. Guys, I think we should explore the boathouse here. Well, why? We already know, this dude just told us that the people we're here to save are in here. But what if that's what if it's a fake? Or what if, we get in there, but the bad guys are in here, and so yeah, we save them, but the bad guys are just going to go off and kidnap some more people. We need to fix the underlying problem. We can't just treat the symptoms. While your real goal was in the boathouse, there's a medallion from a member of the Emerald Enclave that was isn't supposed to be there. The Emerald Enclave isn't supposed to be here, so you need to pick that up and make sure no one finds out. That was the cool stuff about it, and it meant that the adventures themselves are significantly more dynamic, to the point where if you played the same adventure with a different character who belonged to a different faction, it was a very different adventure. And it was just fun. My theory as to why they ditched it, first of all, I know there were some DMs that complained about it because it involved a little bit of extra prep work. And it made starting the games a little bit slower because, again, you had to separate people out by faction and go, hey, you have this adventure. So that was a little bit and for writers specifically, it required more writing. You couldn't just write an adventure with, a storyline and then a few encounters and stuff like that and then a goal at the end. You had to write an adventure that had side quests in it. I know that made it a little bit more difficult to write, especially for new writers. It was just a little more difficult. And so I think that's one of the big reasons why they started de-emphasizing it. And the players were getting a little bit annoyed as well because belonging to a faction, other than sometimes getting a special hook or sometimes getting a special mission, which there weren't a ton of, they weren't really getting a lot of benefits from their faction. Like, they had these tiered things depending on your renown level, but even those just weren't all that great, and the DMs a lot of times would get kind of prissy about it because some of the things would make it more difficult for the DM to railroad the players. Bad DMs specifically would complain about it because they're like, well, it's not fair that they can get spell scrolls. Like, they can just have anything they want and there's nothing I can do to challenge them. There's tons you can do to challenge them. Read the adventure. And so they abandoned it, and now nobody knows who the factions are anymore. And it really, really sucks because, again, they were awesome. They were so, so cool. And it all goes back to the idea that White Wolf did something. Not only did White Wolf do something different, which a lot of other people were doing, but they did it well, and they did it well enough that they were becoming a dominant force in the market. And Wizards wanted to try and get a piece of that puzzle at one point, and then they didn't. And then 5th edition, they brought that idea back, and it worked really, really well. So my recommendation for anyone that is writing your own adventures, again, everything right now is in upheaval, and it won't be in a week, but everything right now is in upheaval. You're gonna write your own stuff. Consider having factions in your campaign that would be interested in some of the party members, not all. If you look at any country in the world, there are multiple factions. If you look at Like our quote unquote two-party system is not a two-party system and hasn't been for years. The idea that all Republicans think the same and all Democrats think the same is nonsense. And the stuff that's happening in the House right now shows it. There's a huge fracture in the Republican Party, and we're finally seeing change from within the inside. I think it was 2016. Was that when Bernie ran? Uh, yeah, 2016. When Bernie ran, you saw a division in the Democratic Party, where you had the Bernie Bros and you had everybody else, and that turned into a debacle. And an unknown third party that people didn't realize existed showed up in the superdelegates and the DNC itself. So factions and subfactions and things like that are extremely common. Everybody likes to belong to a group, and everywhere in the world you will see factions. In retail, in the same store, I knew different factions. It was insane. Even in the store that I worked at, we had a print department. That was one of the stores I worked at, or every store had a print department, but one of them, they actually had their own building that was connected to ours, because they tore out a wall, but they had their own entrance and everything, and it was weird, to be honest. The print department was a different faction than like the sales associates and stuff like that. And the managers were a different faction from this. And like, factions exist everywhere. And yes, it is more work to come up with different factions and that. But the basis of a faction is generally they have some sort of common goal. So find something that some group might want. The Emerald Enclave is all about nature. They're literally tree huggers. So they are entirely focused on what is best for the natural world, which is going to bring them in conflict with something like the Harpers, who the Harpers are effectively the secret agents of Mystra. They are a magic aligned group that is highly secretive, and they work for the goddess of magic, kind of. And so because of that, they are going to have very, very different opinions and very, very different feelings about the same thing. Like, if nature is going to be devastated, but it's going to keep a rogue mage out of power, the Harpers are going to be for it. The Emerald Enclave are going to be against it. The Order of the Gauntlet was your lawful stupid group. They were very much... It was paladins. And anyone could join, but it was paladins. And so they're going to be about the rule of law and making sure order is formed, whereas the Harpers are very much about freedom and making your own choices. So they're both good aligned groups, but they have very different focuses. So putting stuff like that into your campaign and encouraging your players to interact with the factions and perhaps join one, so that every so often to just inject a little bit of nuance and conflict into your adventure, which conflict is why we tell stories. Conflict is storytelling. You can go, hey, you got a message from your faction leader, or you got a message from your faction in some way. They want you to do this. Don't tell anyone else. Even if the goals align 100% of what the faction wants and what the party wants, just because they've been encouraged to keep the secret, it will create conflict, and it turns into something interesting. Yeah. I wanted to talk about the factions because I missed them, and I think they're really, really cool. And again, because of the era of upheaval that we are in, I think a lot of people are looking for ideas to do stuff on their own, and a faction system is 100% a good idea. You don't have to go the Vampire Masquerade route, where you are required, where part of character creation is choosing your faction, and it gives you mechanical benefits. It works for them. I'm not saying that it's bad or anything like that, but that is a very, very complex thing to add. Whereas the faction system of 5th edition, because there are not a ton of mechanical benefits and most of the benefits are going to be more story related, it is significantly easier to kind of balance it and turn it into something interesting and fun. So if you are deciding to create your own thing, whether that is something D&D related or Cypher related or anything else, try putting a faction system in. Try doing something a little bit different. Come up with a few factions. I think 5 factions works really, really well. If you need kind of a guide to help you, pick some alignments off of the alignment chart. You know, again, if we look at the factions in 5th edition, the Order of the Gauntlet is lawful good. The Harpers are chaotic good. The Emerald Enclave is generally considered neutral good or true neutral. The Lord's Alliance, despite the fact that they're aligned with evil, they're generally more lawful neutral because they are about rules and the things like that. And you might be able to argue that they're a little bit more lawful evil with the idea that they are very self-motivated. But they will do altruistic things every so often as well. So lawful neutral fits a little better. And then the Zhentarim are lawful evil. You know, so if you're having a hard time coming up with, well, how am I going to come up with it? Just choose an alignment and understand lawful means they are for rules, laws, and order. Doesn't mean that they are for the greater good. They're not for democracy. They're for rules. Those rules might be bad rules. They might be rules that enforce a caste system. They might be rules that enforce other more devious things like enslavement and things like that. But they're very much interested in upholding the rule of law, whether or not those laws are good or not. That's what lawful means. Chaotic does not mean random. Chaotic means freedom. They're about personal choice. They are about not doing something just because you're told to do it, not doing something simply because that's what the law says. They are the rebels. They are the counterculture. And neutral can be a lot of things. Neutral can be I neither care for law nor freedom, or it can be I care for both and I will do things in various places. But if you're going to be using it as a motivational factor, treat neutral as in I try to keep things in balance. That's not the only way to interpret it, but that's the best way to use it as a motivator. And then good and evil is not good does good things and evil does bad things. Good is selfless. I will do what is in the best interest of the most people possible. And I will actively sacrifice my own good for the good of other people. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. That is what good means. Evil means what's in it for me. I'm going to do whatever benefits me the most. And that sometimes means upholding the rule of law. Sometimes that means working with other people. Sometimes it means doing altruistic things, doing things that are best for everyone, because the other thing where you're doing something that's not going to benefit everyone is also not going to benefit you. So don't define them by good people do good things and evil people do evil things. Good people are selfless. Evil people are selfish. That gives you a motivational structure that will help you to define your factions. And if you want to have 9 factions, you can go for it. I think 5 works really, really well. If you want to go with just 3, you can do that. The recommendation I give is the more factions you have, the more nuance you can add to them. If you have only 2 factions, they only need to differentiate on one subject. And so you could have 2 almost identical factions, just one believes you should wear red hats and the other one believes you should wear purple hats. You know, that's all you need to create a schism is one conflicting belief. As soon as you start adding other ones, you can start adding more nuances. Like, well, yes, you know, this faction actually likes red hats, but they also think Greek suspenders are essential. And the first one is like, no, red hats and nothing. We are naked except for our red hats. And that's when you can start creating some interesting things. So I like the number 5. I think it works really well. And just picking 5 alignments works pretty well, because you can, look at the world that exists and goes, well, how would a chaotic good person view this city or this thing? And you could start making lists of, this is what this faction believes, this is what and it turned into something interesting and fun. Now it's a lot more work, and if you are writing adventures to be published, like the Adventurers League or any other thing where you're writing adventures, it does mean you need to effectively add side quests so that the factions can have something that has an impact on the story. So yes, it creates more complexity in that, but again, my problem with complexity is complexity for complexity's sake. If you're just adding more steps to get to the same solution, that's waste. However, adding complexity to allow for something that can't happen without that, as in giving different characters motivations to do different things on the same adventure, you need something in there to give you a reason to have one character want to do something different from another when they're all on the same mission. And a faction system is a really simple way to implement that. So anyway, that's all for me today. I just wanted to do something. I kind of miss the daily vlogging. I had fun. This is such a strain on my mental state to have to do something every single day, but I enjoy making vlogs and long form content like this. And so you guys may start seeing me bringing more stuff like that. If anyone's made it to the end, I guess I will reward you by giving you this. With all the stuff that is happening with D&D right now, I 100% don't believe 90% of the stuff that's being said there. And to be fair, of that 90%, probably about 60 or 70% of it isn't possible. Like, people are saying nonsense that's not how copyright law works, that's not how contract law works. I know a remarkable lot about both of those subjects because I learned about them in school for various things. Like when I was in the entertainment, when I was trying to get into the entertainment industry, you learn about copyright law real quick, especially in academia, where I had to take crash courses in copyright law because schools tried to use music and stuff like that, and buying performance rights to music is really difficult, especially if your school band is trying to sell tickets to a concert. I had to learn all that stuff. I became the copyright dude for my choir in college, and it was remarkably funny. So I understand this stuff, and a lot of what's saying out there just isn't legally possible. It's people talking out of their ass. However, I have anxiety. I have PTSD and depression, and my brain always thinks the absolute worst thing is going to happen every single time. And the way that I've learned to deal with that, which may or may not be the healthiest, is I make plans for as many contingencies as I can. And so if anyone thinks that in the unlikely event I find out that I'm 100% wrong, it's theoretically possible. I don't think it's very probable, but it's theoretically possible that I'm somehow, the channel's done and I'm never going to do it. No, I've already started coming up with ideas and things for moving away from D&D. And to be blunt, it's been something I've been considering for a while, not because I have any problem with D&D, but because 5th edition is near the end of its life cycle, they're just not giving me as much to make content about. Unless I want to talk about drama, which I don't. So I'm looking into new systems that I can start doing D&D deep dive style series on. And I'm looking for new systems that I can run campaigns in and do one-shots in and stuff like that. That's why I collect. Again, the last time I counted, I think I had 30 different complete RPG systems. So not like just a core book, but I have every book released due to Humble Bundles and other stuff like that. Like, I have every book released for something like 20 or 30 systems. I love them. And I'm constantly looking for new ones to do new things with. So, so I am considering, or to be 100% blunt, I am going to be moving away from D&D at least slightly. No matter what happens with D&D, I don't like drama. I hated making the OGL 1.1 video. I didn't like it. I haven't enjoyed reading the comments on it. I haven't enjoyed making comments on it. I haven't replied to like half of them because, again, most of the ones I haven't replied to are just, "Oh, you're so dumb," and I'm like, well, you can think that, and there's nothing I can do to convince you otherwise. So there's no point in me replying to you. Yeah, I'm going to be branching out. That's just how it is, and I've been planning on. Again, I play over December. I play a bunch of non D&D games. You know, I've done it for 2 years now. And probably the next campaign I run after my D&D campaign that's nearing its conclusion right now, which is running tonight at 9 p.m. Central, is probably not going to be Dungeons & Dragons. And I'm probably not going to be running the next little mini campaign on there. I've already told my players once this campaign is done, one of them gets to run something at least for a month or two, so I can have some time to relax and so I can play the game. I never get to play. So, yeah, anyone that stayed long enough to actually listen to this stuff, understand I am just as scared as you guys are. I put a big tough face on because I have generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder with agoraphobia, and post-traumatic stress disorder, both simple and complex. I understand how fear works. I understand how fear thrives. And fear in general is the easiest thing in the world to spread and the hardest thing in the world to stop. And so for the most part, I'm going to put up a strong face and go, I'm not afraid. But to be 100% honest, I'm just as scared as the rest of you guys. I just happen to have more knowledge about this than some. And because of that, I can see through a lot of the lies that are out there. And it makes it easier for me to put up a strong face. But I 100% don't know exactly what's going to happen. I have my theories. They're grounded in facts and experience. But I've been wrong before. And so I'm going to make, I'm going to make, I'm going to make plans for the worst case scenario, for the best case scenario, and everything in between. And the plans that I choose to go forward with will be the ones that I like the most. And that's how it's going to work. So, yeah. I wasn't planning on having like an update kind of thing like that on this, but it makes sense. And for anyone that listens to me rant for 45 minutes about a faction system, you guys deserve something. So, anyway, that's going to be all for me today. I'll see you guys in the next time. All right? Bye-bye.